My father spent 14 years locked up behind the thick steel doors of the Barry Telford State Penitentiary, located right outside of Texarkana, Texas. Recently, I took an interest in the darker events that happened to various family members and sat down to ask him if he had any chilling stories or experiences he could share about his time as he spent incarcerated. Anything that he hadn't shared with me before. I was both pleased and horrified as, for the next 2 hours, he divulged some truly chilling and grotesque tales. I will just let you know now that some of these stories are graphic, and if you have a weak stomach, I'd advise you not to listen any further. For the rest of you, I won't sparse details and I'll lay them out exactly as he laid them out to me. My dad was sent to the Telford unit a few months after his 21st birthday, sentenced 20 years for armed robbery. It is a maximum security prison designed to mostly hold suspected gang members and violent criminals. The first day is a total shock to your system. You're stripped and cavity searched, coming in and out of every room. You have a bedtime, and you are timed at meals, and thrown into a cell with 3 other inmates telling you the house rules and which bunk is yours. Then laying in bed the first night. That's when it hits you that this is home. That this is your life now. Out of anything that I can recall, the feeling of helplessness and hopelessness, the loss of freedom. That is the scariest part of prison. He told me that as the months pass, you get used to your routine. You start to need the structure, even crave it. He said you decide to make the best of it, learn as many skills as you could, and stay as busy as possible. One of his vocational skills he picked up was plumbing, and soon became the in-house plumber for A building. Now, the way that the prison is set up, there is an A building and a B building. Inside each building, there are 10 cell houses. Each cell house contains 12 cells that can hold anywhere from 1 to 4 inmates each. In the middle of each cell house is the rec room, where the cells are open to, and there is where the inmates spend most of their free time. In addition to the cell houses, each building has contained several solitary wings, labeled from A seg to Z seg. When I first got there, everyone kept joking that if I stepped out of line, the guards would send me to M-Seg. One day I asked my buddy, who had been locked up for 15 years when I already had gotten there, why people kept talking about M-Seg and not any of the other Seg wings. Look, his buddy told him, people who have extended stays in M just don't come back the same. Some don't even come back at all. The guards know it. And that's why they always fill M last. Or put new guys there who think that they might be troublemakers. A night in M will straighten you right up real quick. I've never been there myself, but I talked to a couple inmates that have, and they both told me the same thing. Something evil lives in that place. So like I said, my dad had become the on-call plumber for A building. He said it was about 6 months into the job when he had his first encounter with M-Seg. Whenever a toilet would be stopped up or something leaked, the guards would just knock on my door and lead me to the problem. It was around the clock type of thing. I didn't mind though. Any excuse to get out of my cell was fine by me. Plus, you get your own cell, since you'd be coming in and out at all hours of the night and day, so that was a nice perk as well. Anyway, one night there's a knock on my door and the guard tells me to get dressed, Rashell. We need you in Seg. And I get up and the guard opens my door and we start heading down to Seg. It's a real mess up there. I've seen a lot of shit in my day, but this is crazy. The guard told my dad and led him down to the connecting corridor. Just make sure you wear gloves and booties, Rashell. My dad was curious and asked the guard what had happened. Looney Tune on suicide watch. I guess somehow must have snuck in a piece of metal. Look, I shouldn't tell you this, but I don't want you to be surprised when you get in there. Crazy cut off his own genitals. He threw his testicles out on the run, but we can't find his penis. That's where you come in. When they reached their destination, there was another guard standing outside with an inmate holding a mop waiting to clean up after my dad was finished. My dad said when they opened the door to MSEG, it was almost hauntingly dark. 4 or 5 dim overhead lights ran down the hallway, but seemed to act more like spotlights and gave off practically no ambient light. He said that there was a trail of blood leading towards the back of the corridor. Each seg block had 14 cells with solid steel doors. Each door had a small window that could have opened and closed from the outside, and a tray slit which the guy must have used to toss his testicles out. As he got closer, you could see that the blood was running out from a cell towards the end of the block, through a small gap under the door.
Open 13.
The guard yelled to another guard behind a glass window controlling the electronic locks. When I went into that cell, I couldn't believe how much blood was there. It was on the walls and the ceiling. The entire mattress pad was doused in it. The toilet was flooded up to the brim, and it looked like it was filled with blood. I used a cup to transfer the bloody water into buckets until I could start to see the silhouette of something under the water. I could see a big wad of toilet paper, so I pulled it out and set it on the floor. I could tell that something was inside it. As I started to slowly unravel the wad, all of a sudden, I started hearing this noise coming from the air vents. It sounded like someone crawling or trying to sneak through them almost. I didn't think much of it at this time, but I'll get back to that later. Anyway, I had rolled the paper and sure enough, the guy's pecker was right there. The guard took it and dropped it in a bag of ice, and after making sure the toilet flushed, he started leading my dad back to the entrance of MSEG. When we got down the hall waiting for the exit door to open, all of the lights went out. "Shit," muttered the guard. "Against the wall, inmate." I stood against the wall, my dad continued, and as the guard tried to figure out what was going on, I heard that noise in the vents again. It was almost coming from the cell that I had just come out of. I didn't know what it was, but it gave me this awful feeling. And as I was standing there, it was getting louder and faster, closer to me. It sounded like whatever was in that vent was now in a dead sprint right at us. The guard was trying to ignore it, but I could tell that he heard it too, because he kept looking back over his shoulder and started yelling at the guard behind the glass. "Hey! Hey! Hurry up, get this fucking door open!" And just as the noise in the vent got right up to us, the lights came back on, and it went silent. The door opened up, and the guard got us out of there as fast as he could. A few days later, I saw the inmate who was waiting on janitor duty that night and asked him if he had seen anything. He told me he saw them wheel a guy covered in blood out on a stretcher, and that he was screaming about a man in the vents, and that the man had told him to do it. My dad also asked him if he had heard anything in the vents while he was mopping up, but he told my dad that he didn't hear anything, and he found the metal the man from 13 had used to cut himself. It was buried in a pool of blood, the guy said. Damnedest thing too, looked like a piece of shrapnel cut from an air duct metal. The next story my dad shared with me is more graphic and scary in the sense of what human beings are capable of. We get new guys that think that they're going to be badasses all the time. Sometimes it works out for them, and other times it doesn't. There were lots of serious gangs in BTU, and sometimes you get a guy who comes in from the local street gang that doesn't really comprehend how violent some of these big gangs are. It's like they are playing gang to look cool, like kids play cops and robbers. The problem is that they think that other people are just playing gang too or something. Anyway, we had this guy, Ricky, come in, and everyone but him knew that it was going to end badly for him. He was this young Hispanic guy, and he thought his small-town gang was a direct rival to another Hispanic gang, MS-13. He would curse out and disrespect them in front of everyone at chow times and in the halls, and scream at their members who'd pass his cell. He'd only been there for a week. Some of the elders tried to tell him he needed to calm down before he got hurt, but Ricky was hard-headed and just wouldn't hear it. Well, one day during dinner, the chow hall was quiet and Ricky was nowhere to be seen. My table was dismissed first, and we made our way back to our cell house, and when we turned the corner to see Ricky, covered in blood, stumbling right towards us, arms wrapped around his stomach. He was completely naked, big patches of his skin cut from his body where his tattoos had been. Both of his eyes were popped out from their sockets and were just dangling towards the ground. The side of his head was caved in where they had stomped his skull until his eyes came out. As he came closer, I could see that he was holding his intestines in his hands. The worst part to me is that he hadn't died yet, and that he was conscious for every blow and every cut. He just hobbled up the hall and into our direction, crying and asking, "Why can't I look up? Why can't I look up?" He collapsed and passed out a few seconds later, and died right there at our feet. They never found out who did it. Alright, I'll share one more story my dad shared with me that I found kind of creepy, as this is going to get pretty long. About 7 years into his stint in prison, my dad said through a series of circumstances, he ended up having to stay the night in MSEG. The A building was being renovated and repaired, and as a result, they were sending the inmates to stay in the SEG in waves. Well, it had been years since my dad had been to the rarely used MSEG, and he had convinced himself that he was just hearing things that night. They were leading prisoners out of the cells at the time and transferring them to various SEG blocks. My dad's cell was at the end, and he had his cell to himself. So when they transferred him, it wasn't accompanied by any other inmate. To his dismay, all the SEG blocks had been filled, except for M. They led him down to the end of M and opened the door to 14, which was right next to the cell that man had cut himself all those years ago. Everything was fine until lights out. It was really dark in there. Each cell had a little nightlight above the toilet, but that's not enough to see anything or read or write. Anyway, it was so dark I figured the only thing that I could do was go to sleep. But all night, I kept hearing the guy in the cell next to me talking to himself. The way that the cells are set up, the vents carry any little noise to the adjoining cells. The vents themselves are located right at the foot of the little cots in each cell. People would sit next to them to communicate and pass time during stints of solitary, but this guy wasn't talking to me because he was just talking to himself. And it was really starting to wear on my nerves. I banged on the vent and told him to just keep it down. But he kept on chanting this odd thing over and over, and I couldn't make out what he was saying. I put my ear up to the vent to try and see what he was saying, but my hair stood on the back of my head when I swear to God, I felt his breath in my ear as clear as day, and I heard him whispering, "I remember you. I remember you. I remember you." in this frantic, melodic tune. "Well, you won't remember anything when I bash your head in if you don't keep it down in there," I told him. And all of a sudden, his voice got a little louder and angrier in tone. "I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat." I was a little unnerved, but I'd heard a lot worse after so many years in prison, so I just told him to fuck off and decided I'd let the guards deal with it in the morning. Well, morning came and went, and when the guard brought me my breakfast, I told him if he didn't do something about the guy keeping me up all night in 13, that I would. "What are you talking about, Rashell? You're the only person in MSEG," the guard told me as chills ran down my spine. That night, as soon as the lights went out, the whispers started again. And this time, I was petrified. "I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat." The whispers were more aggressive this time, even clearer. Then, all of a sudden, they went from whispers to deep, guttural screams. "I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your throat. I'll slit your fucking throat." It scared me so bad, I fell out of my cot and scooted on the floor until I felt my back hit the wall opposite the air vent. As my eyes came into focus in absolute horror, I saw the silhouette of a head directly inside the vent. I couldn't make out its features, but I could see its eyes. They were full of hatred and rage, and they were locked right on me. Fast and louder, he just continued screaming that he would slit my throat. And as the vent cast started to shake, now the vent going straight up into the duct to a main duct, then back down to the next cell through another duct. So you can't see into your neighbor's cell from your cell. That meant whatever this thing was, it was right inside my vent. I jumped up and banged on the steel door as hard as I could, telling and yelling for a guard. "Help! Help! Somebody!" A guard came running down the hall, and as soon as he slid the door window open, the vent went silent. "You gotta help me here. Something is in that vent," I pleaded. And to my surprise, the guard did not protest. Instead, he just told me to hang tight for a second and then clicked his radio and said, "Need an open cell for a transfer from MSEG." He paused for a second, then leaned back into his radio and simply said, "He's back." He opened the door and led me down the corridor, and as they did the whole time that we were followed by that familiar sound from the vents. I've seen and heard a lot in my years. Not a lot gets under my skin, but I was shaking like a leaf that whole way out of MSEG. I don't think I took a breath until I walked out the blocked doors and heard them shut right behind me. I finally worked up the nerve to ask the guard what the hell was in those vents. "I don't know, Rashell. Warden will tell you that there's nothing in those vents. All I can tell you is that whatever it is, it's evil." My dad told me some interesting rumors and theories about who the man in the vent might have been, and even a theory as to why the guard had said he's back, one that deals with a failed exorcism and a cover-up by the warden, as well as a few more spooky stories both related to and not related to MSEG, as well as a few more spooky stories both related to and not related to MSEG that some fellow inmates had told him. Lots of tales of violence. But I thought that I'd keep those to a minimum. Anyway, if you're interested about hearing maybe some more, maybe I'll let you know.